What I'm going to do is share some of the research that we've been doing at the Center for the Edge that I run, a research center here in San Francisco for Deloitte. And we've been focused for about a decade now on what we call the big shift, which is the long-term forces that are reshaping the global business landscape. And clearly one of the reasons we have such a close relationship with Singularity is our belief is that the exponential technologies that you've been hearing about and will continue to hear about are central to that big shift. And it takes many different forms. There are many different dimensions of this shift. I'm just going to quickly summarize three of them. One is the notion of moving from a world of stocks to a world of flows. And what we mean by that is if you think of how business has been run for the past century or more, it's around the notion that the key source of value is proprietary knowledge. It's having knowledge stocks that nobody else has access to, and then as efficiently as possible, extracting the value of those knowledge stocks and delivering it to the marketplace. Here's the problem. In an exponential world, knowledge stocks depreciate at an accelerating rate. So if all you're focused on is protecting your knowledge stocks, you're going to be out of business. In that kind of world, our belief is the key to value creation is to find ways to participate more effectively in a broader range of more diverse knowledge flows. And there are some companies that are starting to do this. There's one company that's an interesting one. Virtually no one has heard of it. All of you, I'm sure, have heard of the iPod. Enormous success. The story behind the iPod is there was another company called Portal Player, which came into existence a number of years before the iPod was ever an idea. And their focus was on how do we take all the technologies required to develop digital music players and make those technologies really feasible for a mass market offering. And what they did was they created a global network of leading technology companies in all the different domains that were required to develop a digital music player. And over a period of several years, worked them together to come up with very rapid innovation and learning around what was going to be required for these digital music players to become commercially successful. The first iPod that was introduced had an Apple user interface and design factor on the outside, but the inside of that device was a Portal Player device. It would not have been possible without that kind of global network that harnessed knowledge flows at a very scalable level. So that's one dimension of this big shift, moving from stocks to flows. A second dimension is moving from a world of push to a world of pull. And what we mean by that focuses on how do you mobilize resources. Again, for centuries now, we have had companies built and hugely successful around a push-based model. You develop a forecast or prediction of demand, and then you push all the right people and the right resources into the right place at the right time to meet that demand. Very successful. In a world of increasing uncertainty, that model is increasingly challenged. And our belief is the companies that will continue to create value in this big shift are those that harness the ability to tap into scalable pull platforms, where you can draw out the people and resources when you need them and where you need them, on demand. Fundamentally different model. And in fact, the companies that are most sophisticated and most advanced in terms of developing these scalable pull platforms are actually not here in the US. And they're not even in Western Europe or the developed economies. They're in China and India. And we've spent a long time studying many of these companies in a very diverse set of industries. I'll just quickly identify one company called Li & Fung. It's in the apparel industry, the clothing industry. Their customers are apparel designers around the world. All the brand names we know and love, Calvin Klein and Taylor. What they do is they organize and orchestrate all the activities required from sourcing of raw materials through all the stages of production to delivery to whatever retail distribution center you specify in the world for an item of apparel. The interesting thing about Li and Feng is they do none of that activity themselves. They operate through a global network of 15,000 business partners, and they draw out the right expertise at the right time, at the right place to meet demand. And I don't think it's an accident that they developed this model in the apparel industry where forecasts and predictions are particularly challenging. There's a lot of uncertainty about demand for apparel. So this notion of scalable pull platforms, by the way, at a time when most Western companies are shrinking the number of participants in their supply networks, Li and Feng is expanding. They're at 15,000 every day. They're adding new partners to their network, because their belief is that pull platform will become more and more valuable as more and more participants join in. So that's the second dimension, moving from push to pull to mobilize resources. There's a third dimension which gets to how do you organize the business. And here the distinction, the shift that we see is moving from scalable efficiency, which Salim mentioned, to scalable learning. The scalable efficiency model focuses on predictability and reliability. And the way you get predictability and reliability, number one, you tightly specify every activity that's done in the organization. You standardize those activities so that they're done in exactly the same efficient way everywhere in the organization. And then you tightly integrate all the activities to remove all those inefficient buffers. So tightly specified, highly standardized, tightly integrated. That's the scalable efficiency model. And again, huge success for that model. The challenge is we're moving into a world where it's not about scalable efficiency. In an exponential world, the most important imperative is to learn faster. If you're not learning faster, you're going to fall farther and farther behind. And so our belief is the large institutions that will be successful in the future will organize around the model of scalable learning and completely rethink the work environment, work practices around what does it take to accelerate learning and performance improvement throughout our organization. And not in a training room, but in the work environment. Our belief actually is training programs are going to become less and less relevant in an exponential world. The most powerful learning will occur in the workplace and beyond the workplace. In this context, one of the quotes that we take great inspiration from is Bill Joy, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who made the observation one day. He said, look, he said, no matter how many smart people you have within your organization, just remember one thing. There are a lot more smart people outside your organization than inside it. And so if you're truly committed to scalable learning and you just focus on the people within your organization, guess what? You're never going to scale learning to the same extent as companies that focus on how to connect with and build relationships with a broader and broader range of third parties so that everyone can learn faster together. That's a fundamentally different mindset and way of organizing. And by the way, in that context, I'll just go back briefly to that company Li and Feng I mentioned, that Chinese company. 15,000 business partners. One of the things we did was we spent time interviewing many of those business partners to find out what they were doing as part of the Li and Feng network. And one of the questions we asked is, well, why are you part of the Li and Feng network? Without exception, without prompting, top of mind, the answer we got back from every one of those partners, the reason we're part of the Li and Feng network is because we learn faster than we ever could on our own or as part of anyone else's network. Now, I will tell you, I've interviewed many partners of Western companies. I have never once heard that answer. Because we learn faster? Are you kidding me? We get squeezed harder. Fundamentally different orientation to scalable learning through global networks of ever-expanding numbers of partners and participants. So, if you think about these three shifts that I've talked about, creates huge opportunity. Enormous opportunity for value creation that's unprecedented. Exponential value creation. But I want to quickly highlight something that doesn't get talked about very much, which is what I call the dark side of this big shift. And by dark side, I'm not talking about cybercrime, cybersecurity, privacy. There are many issues that float around. I'm talking about something that's intrinsic to this big shift. It will not happen without this dark side. And what I mean by the dark side here is mounting performance pressure. Mounting performance pressure on all of us as individuals and as institutions. It comes in many different forms. And part of that pressure is intensifying competition. The impact of these digital infrastructures on a global scale is to systematically and substantially reduce barriers to entry and barriers to movement across the world. So it's a much more intense competitive environment. If that weren't bad enough, there's a second dimension of pressure and challenge, which is the accelerating pace of change. One of the studies that have been done in more and more industries is product life cycle compression. It turns out in more and more markets and industries, product life cycles are compressing at a significant rate. So even if you manage to come up with a wonderful new product or service and get it into the marketplace, guess what? You have shorter and shorter time to enjoy the benefit of that innovation. And the question is, what do you have next? And how soon can you get it in the marketplace? And then there's a third dimension of pressure, which is because of all this connectivity that we've created on a global scale. A tiny event off in a small, faraway place of the world that we've never even heard of quickly cascades into an extreme event, something that Taleb has called the black swans. They come out of nowhere and disrupt our best laid plans and predictions and leave us scrambling to figure out what the hell are we going to do now. So these three forms of pressure come together: intensifying competition, accelerating pace of change, and extreme disruptive events. And that's a pretty dark side. Now, just to make it concrete, I'll share with you another piece of research we did at the Center for the Edge, which was around how have companies done in this big shift. We looked at US companies, but we looked at all US companies that were public, that are listed on a public exchange. We went back to 1965, which was a few years before digital technology really came into the business world, until today, 1965 until today. We took as our measure of performance, and we can debate, it's not a perfect measure, but we think it's good enough for this point. We took return on assets. In all this world of exponential opportunity, with all this incredible digital technology, how have companies done from 1965 until today? It turns out, for all public companies in the US, from 1965 until today, return on assets has basically collapsed. It's gone down by 75% over that time period. It's been a long, sustained erosion. There are waves that correspond to the short-term economic cycles, but it's been a clear long-term trend. There is no sign of it leveling off, and certainly no sign of it turning around. So if you want a measure of mounting performance pressure and our increasing inability to deal with that pressure, we think that's a pretty good indicator of the dark side of all this technology. And our belief is at the fundamental level, what's going on here is not the intensifying competition and all of that, which is certainly a contributor, but the fundamental factor is that there's a growing disconnect between the mindsets practices and organizations that we run, and the increasingly exponential world that we live in. And until we address that disconnect and make that big shift, we're not going to be able to address that mounting performance pressure effectively. So in that context, I want to briefly describe some of the issues around transformation, because if you take our perspective on big shifts seriously, it implies fundamental transformation of every institution that we have, not just companies, but schools, NGOs, governments. All institutions are going to have to transform. There's only one lesson that I take. I've been involved in large-scale transformation now for almost 40 years. The one lesson I will share with you from all that experience is if you believe that transformation is a rational process, if you believe that it's about gathering the right data, doing the right analytics, putting it on the right charts, presenting it to the right people, you've already lost, in my experience. In my experience, transformation is fundamentally a political process, not a rational process, and it has only 3 objectives. One objective: identify and neutralize by every means possible the enemies of change. And that's not as easy as it sounds, by the way, because at least in my experience, I have never seen a senior leader get up in a leadership meeting and announce, "I am an enemy of change." Maybe you have. Typically, they sit around the table, they smile, they nod, and say, "Yes, we need to change." And then they go into the privacy of their offices to conspire to figure out how to crush this threat. So identify, neutralize, by any means possible, the enemies of change. Second objective: identify and strengthen, by all means possible, the champions of change. And then there's a third objective that I take great inspiration from a book that I hope many of you have read, certainly recommend to all of you, called The Art of War. One of the key messages in The Art of War is if you have to confront the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. So the goal here, and very counterintuitive, is to resist the temptation to confront the enemies of change, in battle, until the enemies have become so weak and the champions so strong that a battle isn't even necessary. It's a foregone conclusion as to who's going to win. So resist that temptation to confront. Now, if you take all this seriously, it helps to explain. Salim mentioned the evidence that transformation efforts have a very high failure rate, typical transformation efforts, because they're top-down, big bang approaches to transformation that immediately bring out the immune system and the antibodies that I guarantee exist in every large organization around the world, and that are very effective at crushing the efforts to change. And in that context, our belief is there is an approach to transformation that is actually enabled by this exponential world that we're living in. And it's what we call scaling edges. But it's finding an edge to the current business that today has modest revenue and profitability. But because of the exponential forces that are at work in our broader business environment, has the potential to scale, not just to the point where it becomes an interesting new revenue source or diversification, but it actually will become the new core of your company or business. It will generate the bulk of the revenue and profitability of your business. That's the key, is finding that kind of edge and then adopting a set of edge strategies. And we've ended up with 12 design principles to fashion these kinds of scaling edge strategies. I'll just, because of time, only share one of those principles. It's actually, again, pretty counterintuitive. It's the notion of starve the edge. You found an edge that's the future of your business, that will, in the future, generate the bulk of your revenue and profitability. Starve it? Are you kidding me? That's our future. We need to pour as much money as possible into that. We can't let that fail. No, resist that temptation. Starve the edge for 3 reasons. First of all, if you pour a ton of money into that edge, that money is coming from somewhere else in your company. And guess what? The immune system and the antibodies are going to come out and attack to get that money back. So resist the temptation to take all that money and pour it into the edge. Second reason to not do it is it builds complacency on the edge. Hey, the leadership team on the edge, we got a lot of money. Things are good. Let's go out and have a drink. No, you want a sense of urgency. We got almost no money. How the hell are we going to do anything? And the third reason is because when you starve the edge, it forces the edge team from day one to be very aggressive in saying, where can we reach out and connect to other parties to leverage our own scarce resources? So from day one, they're adopting this kind of network and platform-based mindset that is so critical to the big shift and to transformation. So resist the temptation, again, to pour a lot of money into the edge. I'll just say one other principle on the scaling edges is focus on trajectory of performance. One of the things we find is that when you're driving an edge initiative, often executives will look at how did we do this quarter? And they just take that snapshot of performance. Our belief is that for edges to scale and become the agent of transformation, you have to focus on the trajectory and accelerating pace of performance improvement. Linear performance improvement on the edge is not acceptable. Unless it's accelerating, it will never scale to become the new core of your business. So that becomes the focus and the expectation on the part of the edge initiative. So it's a very different way of thinking about transformation. And by the way, our recommendation is never take that edge. There's a lot of approaches around things like skunk works, where you go out on the edge, you do something, you give it some resource and let it get to critical mass, and then you take it and shove it back into the core to use it as a catalyst for change. Guess what? The immune system and the antibodies are extraordinarily effective at identifying those foreign bodies and crushing them as they come back into the core. So don't try to push it back into the core. Scale it on the edge, and over time, pull more and more of the people and resources from the core out to this new edge that's scaling. That's a fundamentally different model. And we believe huge opportunity around it. And there are some examples of companies that have done this successfully, but our belief, again, is because of the exponential changes that are going on as a result of the big shift, this scaling edge approach becomes more and more feasible and attractive as a way to drive transformation relative to traditional approaches. I'll just leave on one final note, which is a positive note. I actually started my career many, many years ago with a company called Boston Consulting Group, BCG. At the time, they had one chart, I'm oversimplifying, but one chart basically that made their success. And they looked at performance improvement over time. They started looking at the semiconductor industry, and they found in the semiconductor industry over time, operating performance, not of the device, but of the business, improved at a very predictable and consistent rate. And they called it the experience curve. Over time, they applied that methodology to virtually every market or industry you could imagine, everything from Japanese beer to toilet paper. Turns out every one of those markets and industries had this experience curve that described and predicted how performance would improve in that market or industry. Remarkably accurate and perceptive. Big problem with the experience curve. It's a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you gain in a market or industry, the longer and harder you have to work to get that next increment of performance improvement. But that's the way the world was run in a world of scalable efficiency. Our belief is, as we move in the big shift to a world of scalable learning, that for the first time, we're going to see the potential for an increasing returns curve, where the more people who participate and the more experience that's gained, the faster everyone's going to learn, and the more rapidly performance is going to improve and value be created. That increasing returns curve is a hugely exciting one. Thank you very much.